The Master Will Appear. Written by L.A. Witt. Narrated by Michael Ferraiuolo. Chapter 1. Misha. "Oh, for God's sake," Fred groaned as we walked out of the locker room into the NorCal University Fencing Club's training area. The fluorescent lights gleamed on his bald spot as he shook his head. "I was hoping that asshole wouldn't be back." I looked around. Who? But a split second later, I knew the answer. The crowd was like today, as it often was in the afternoons, but every piste was occupied by sparring pairs. Most were in decent form, including a sizable portion of the novices. The footwork was solid, even if the blade work was a little clumsy. Pairs moved back and forth as one person gained the advantage, then the other, then the first again. Blades clanged and clicked and scraped. And on the second-to-last piste, there was one of those juggernaut assholes who frustrated the novices and irritated the advanced. His technique centered around aggression and nothing else. With no finesse and no real control, he drove his opponent to the end of the piste until she was rocking back on her heels to avoid his foil. I rolled my eyes. "Another one of those." "Mm-hmm," Fred grumbled as he pulled on his glove. "Seems like we get one or two every year. That one came in last week and now he's back. Oh joy, oh joy." I gave a quiet sniff of amusement. As we watched, the cocky prick scored the winning point against his opponent, knocking her back a step. They both lowered their foils, and she tucked hers beneath her arm so she could take off her mask and gingerly rub her shoulder. He also took off his mask. His fair skin was flush, dark hair damp enough to curl around the edges. I suspected he was in his mid-20s or so, and even if he wasn't a good fencer, he obviously kept himself fit. Maybe a weightlifter? A basketball player? Too lean for football, too built for a runner, and entirely too young for you, Bodnikov. They were both oblivious to me, fortunately. Ending their bout, they shook hands. Well, at least someone had taught him that much. His sweaty, beaming face was as smug as it was handsome, though, which dampened the sportsmanship of the moment. His scowling opponent muttered something to a friend as she left the piste. I hated fencers like him. They weren't even fencers, just brutes with foils. Like so many jackasses before him, this kid had won by virtue of being so violently aggressive that his opponent couldn't retaliate. The woman tossed her blonde hair as she and a friend strode toward the locker room. Her features were taut and her eyes narrow, irritation radiating from her as palpably as arrogance radiated off her opponent. Understandably so, too. She was probably a competent fencer, but she'd been too busy defending herself to get a thrust in edgewise. A win for him in the end, but abysmal form. Abysmal form that wouldn't hold up against a seasoned fencer. Like me. "You know," I adjusted my mask under my arm, "I think he needs to spar with someone who's more on his level." Fred looked at me and grinned. "You gonna show him who's boss, eh?" He slapped my shoulder. "Go get him." I chuckled and headed for the piste. The idiot was challenging another fencer. Someone his own size, who was wisely uninterested after watching the last bout. "Looking for someone to spar with?" I asked. He turned toward me and grinned, brown eyes still gleaming from his victory. "Bring it, old man." I raised my eyebrows. Old man? I probably had 20 years on him, but... "All right, you're on." We'd see who the old man was after I'd cleaned the floor with his arrogant hide. Las Palmas Fencing Club, my non-collegiate team, was much too quiet on the weekends for my taste, and my own university's club was lacking in members and equipment, so while I worked at prodding for more funding and exposure, I fenced here sometimes with friends from the faculty. Usually it was an enjoyable way to spend an afternoon, especially if some of the humanities professors showed up. While I tried to maintain a certain level of decorum, I wasn't above some good-natured science versus humanities trash-talking. Once in a while, though, we had these boys show up to lord their talent over the less experienced members. Usually, all it took was a skilled opponent or two giving them a lesson in humility, and they'd either leave or pull themselves together. Your turn, kid. We stood on the pista and put on our masks. He gave a half-assed salute, which I expected. I refused to do the same, and gave a proper one, touching my hilt to my mask, then making a downward sweep with the blade. The whipping sound of the weapon slicing through the air made him jump. Good. I sized him up as we faced off. He was slightly taller than me, so probably hovering just above 6 foot, but he was a fraction of an inch narrower in the shoulders. If this were wrestling, we'd have been evenly matched. In fact, he'd probably have had an edge, since he was at least 20 years younger than me. And although I kept myself in peak physical condition, there was something to be said for the stamina of youth. A lot of things to be said about it, I noted, as I gave him a subtle down-up glance. He was much too young, but we had been a few years closer together. I shook the thought away. I was here to fence, to put him in a much-needed place of understanding that precision and discipline overrode youth and brute strength. His stance was all right. His feet were more or less in the correct position, though he held his blade higher than I would have suggested and bent his elbow too much. His shoulders were straight, though he hunched forward just slightly. Preemptive aggression, which was no surprise from a fencer like him. The match hadn't even begun, and he was already poised to attack. I was honestly surprised he wasn't bouncing on the balls of his feet like a boxer before the bell. I watched him, subtly adjusting my grip on my foil. Oh, my arrogant boy, fencers like you are a dime a dozen. Fred stood beside the pista. En garde! Pris, allez! Instantly the kid went on the offensive, advancing rapidly and thrusting his blade at me just before he lunged. If there was one thing that didn't intimidate me, though, it was an opponent coming at me like a fucking bull, especially when I knew he had little, if any, control over his blade. I stood my ground and casually parried, redirecting his foil to go past my shoulder. Inertia kept him moving, and before he could recover, I riposted without even bothering to move my feet, thrusting at him with my own foil and letting him run right into the tip. He hit it hard enough to bow at my blade and gave a satisfying grunt. 1 point. Fred didn't bother hiding his equally satisfying smirk. The kid rubbed the spot where the foil had hit him, but his head was turned enough for his mask's mesh to obscure any scowl or glare he might have worn. No matter, I'd made my point, as it were. We took our positions again. Now I could see him, and he locked eyes with me, his fierce determination palpable from here. En garde, Fred called out. Pris, allez! Predictably, he came at me again. I humored him and retreated, most likely thinking he had the upper hand. He attacked even more aggressively. I planted my feet, redirected his foil to the empty space above my shoulder, and scored my second point in his gut. He swore, but only loud enough for me and perhaps Fred to hear. All around us, people clapped and a few chuckled. There were no shoes squeaking on mats or blades clanking against blades, so I could only assume everyone had stopped to watch. Fine by me. How many points? I asked my opponent as I tugged at my glove. First to 5? Sure, yeah, first to 5. The third point was another easy one. He attacked, and in a heartbeat he was wearing the point of my foil just above his hip. He was angry now, and it showed. The tension in his shoulders was visible through his jacket, as was the way they rose and fell with heavy, frustrated breathing. Even with his thick glove on, it was plain to see how tightly he was gripping his foil. I suppose now wasn't the time to point out that if his hand was getting tired, there was a very simple solution. Allez! Fred had barely given the command, and my flustered opponent was coming toward me. This kid probably had no idea how predictable he was. Like any novice, he attacked with his blade, not his feet, and all I had to do was wait for his center of gravity to shift before I retaliated. He came forward, blade already extended. I planted my feet and parried hard, using my blade to shove his aside, which sent his flying out of his hand, while he stumbled to avoid crashing into me. Before his weapon had hit the floor, my own jabbed his pectoral. He grunted, though I couldn't tell if it was pain or frustration. Likely both, given how hard he and the blade had collided. As it was, the impact reverberated up my arm and into my shoulder. Like before, I'd barely moved. All I'd had to do was deflect his aggressive attempts and casually let him hit my weapon. "Damn it," he grumbled, and rubbed the spot as he stooped to pick up his foil. While he wasn't looking, I grumbled a curse and rubbed my right hip. We'd barely moved our feet, but just assuming my stance had been enough to make some muscles protest. Maybe in my 20s I'd been able to do this without warming up, but that practice didn't entirely agree with 45. I'd need to stretch properly before I sparred with anyone else. "Misha's next point wins," Fred chuckled. "You might want to try scoring, kid." My opponent shot him a glare that was visible even through the mesh, and I suppressed a grin behind my own mask. I felt a bit sorry for him now. He'd have some bruises tomorrow, I guessed, but his pride had probably taken more of a beating than anything, which had been my intent, of course. Nothing brought a cocky son of a bitch down a peg like being beaten by someone who knew how to play the game. Humiliation wasn't my idea of fun, but I'd been a fencer like him in my younger days. This was the kind of wake-up he needed to either go find another sport or pull his head out of his ass and learn to fence properly. By now I was pretty sure I'd made my point. I was tempted to call it a match and save him the additional blow to the ego, but he took his position. When the match began, he didn't move. A few seconds passed. He was twitchy, adjusting and readjusting his too-tight grip, but he didn't move. Finally, I can fence. I advanced, driving him back a few steps, and when he was off balance, I lunged. A second too late, I realized I'd overextend my lunge enough to make my knee twinge. The heartbeat of distraction gave him enough time to parry my blade. As I retreated, I gritted my teeth behind my mask. I didn't dare let myself limp visibly. No way was I giving his old man comment any mileage. Ignoring the ache, I retreated and studied him, wondering if he'd wised up or if he was just waiting for the opportunity to attack. I feinted, smacking the toe of my shoe on the pista. He jumped, immediately went on the offensive, and ran right into my foil. Again. Disc, you almost had me fooled into thinking you were learning." 5 points to 0, Fred announced. "The bout goes to Mikhail." The kid muttered something as he took off his mask, ruffling his sweaty, dark hair as he did. Shame about the age and attitude, I thought, as I gave him another quick down-up while my eyes were still hidden by my mask. Because he is certainly not liking in appearance. He wiped some sweat off his brow and, still breathing hard, extended his other hand. "Good match." "Likewise." I took off my mask, tucked it under one arm, and shook his hand. "You're new to the club, I presume?" "Yeah." He avoided my eyes, a new layer of pink growing in his cheeks. "Not quite new to fencing, but maybe newer than I thought." I had to give him credit. He wore chastened well. Quite well. My whole body prickled with goosebumps, but I shook myself. No matter how attractive he was or how much I loved the newfound humility in his gaze, he was much too young for me. "Well," I cleared my throat, "a few lessons and some discipline, and you'll get there. Maybe an ego check while you're at it?" "Yeah, probably." He lifted his gaze. His eyes flicked toward my jacket, and his eyes widened a little. "Wait, you belong to Las Palmas?" I glanced down at the faded, embroidered insignia. "I do." "They have a team, right? One that competes, like, outside the collegiate league?" I nodded. There was a hint of East Coast at the edges of his words. Not a heavy accent, but definitely not a local one. So, that team. He shifted a little. How do I get on it? Get on it? I chuckled. By fencing properly. His already flushed cheeks darkened even more, but he didn't speak. Some practice will do you well, I said. Good luck. I turned to go join Fred and the others for the friendly sparring I'd come here for. Will you teach me? I stopped in my tracks and turned around. What? The cockiness was completely gone from his expression, replaced by something more childlike? No, that wasn't it. Genuine? Something different, anyway, as if he wore that newfound humility on his sleeve, and the arrogance had been as much a mask as the protective ones we'd both worn. I want to learn to fence. Do it right, I mean. He swallowed, and again asked, Will you teach me? Chapter 2. Ryan. The question was out, and there was no pulling it back. And I didn't want to pull it back. I wanted to fence like he did, and I wanted him to show me how. Heart pounding under one of the throbbing bruises he'd inflicted, I waited for him to respond. Mikhail, apparently that was his name, came back toward me, moving slowly but somehow just as deliberately as he had during our match. I was zeroed in on the way he moved now. How every step and even the tilt of his head seemed so calculated. This wasn't some old guy who picked up a foil on the weekends. He was precise and graceful? Was that the word? Maybe. And because he kind of reminded me of that dancer my mom dated a few years ago. Mikhail was taller and broader, probably hiding all kinds of sculpted muscles under that faded fencing jacket. But he carried himself like he knew at all times exactly what every single molecule of his body was doing. I realized too late that I'd been staring at him, but he didn't seem to notice. In fact, he was staring right back at me, scrutinizing me in a way I didn't think I'd ever been scrutinized. It took all I had not to squirm under his gaze, which was weird because I was used to the bored and/or annoyed glares of people who had no use for me. Why did this feel different? And why did I care? And why did I have to consciously keep breathing instead of holding my breath while I waited for his answer? But finally, voice low and even, he asked, Are you serious, or being a smartass? His accent was subtle but sharp, and somehow made the question even terser. Yeah, I gulped. I am. I'm being serious. You really want to learn to fence? I nodded. Yes, I'd like to be good at this. With a half-hearted laugh, I added, I'm not as good as I thought I was, I guess. No laugh, more silent scrutiny. Jesus, this guy was intense. Russian, if the accent was any indication, not to mention the name. Easily in his 40s, judging by the lines in his face and at the corners of his intense blue eyes, not to mention the gray in his otherwise black hair. He closed some more distance between us. Yeah, definitely 40s. Maybe even one of those guys who could pull off early 50s? And what if you do learn to fence? Then what? I cocked my head. I'm not sure I understand. Do you want to compete? With a grin that was almost as subtle as his accent, he added a faintly sarcastic, Aim for the Olympics? I'd like to compete, yeah. Don't know how high up, though. The truth was, I did want to aim for the Olympics eventually. I'd fantasized about Olympic gold medals ever since my first lesson 5 years ago. Suddenly, those seemed like exactly that, fantasies. With soon-to-be bruises aching all over my torso, I had no illusions left. My dad was right. I sucked. But I could fix that, right? I could damn well learn to fence, start there, compete later. The medals, and proving my father wrong, could wait. Mikhail was quiet for another long, unnerving moment. He glanced toward the other older guys, mostly professors I recognized from around campus, and pushed out a breath. Standing here talking to me was probably not high on his priority list. I opened my mouth to withdraw the request so I could get the hell out of this club, but he spoke first. I didn't get your name. He didn't offer a hand, but then we'd already shaken hands. I swallowed. Ryan O'Connor. Ryan. He gave a nod like he somehow approved of it. Mikhail Budnikov. I said nothing, and wasn't sure what I should say, so I just nodded too. Then he stood a bit straighter and looked me right in the eye. I have keys to Las Palmas. Get the address from the website. 9 o'clock, tomorrow morning. Don't be late. Something told me he wasn't kidding. He struck me as the kind of guy who'd be gone at 1 minute after 9, even if he saw me sprinting in from my car with an excuse about shitty traffic. Right, 9. What the hell did I just sign up for? I'll be there. I arrived at Las Palmas at 8:45 the next morning. It was about 20 minutes from my house in light traffic, so I'd left early because I wasn't taking any chances. As I pulled into a parking space, it occurred to me that even though this was a weekday, Mikhail had never asked if I had classes at this hour or if I had a job. Truthfully, I didn't have anything on my schedule except a date with my oil paints and canvas, but he didn't know that. Though I probably could have suggested a different time or day if I'd had a conflict. In the moment, it hadn't even occurred to me. 9 o'clock today or nothing. Take it or leave it. Maybe he figured if this was important to me, I'd rearrange my schedule. Now that I thought about it, he was probably right, and I couldn't quite explain why. It wasn't like he was the only experienced fencer in town, but here I was, 15 minutes early like I had nowhere else to be, because I didn't. He also hadn't asked about my previous experience with fencing, but I supposed he didn't really need to at this point. I sucked. End of story. My cheeks burned at the memory of our match. What was I thinking? I hadn't gone up against an experienced fencer before. Well, not that experienced, anyway. Oh, but I was the shit, and I'd known it. And hadn't he schooled me otherwise? I decided a long time ago I would be a solid and competitive fencer. I would fence, and I would win, period. Apparently, I'd just gotten ahead of myself and decided I already was solid and competitive, when in fact I was barely competent. Getting my ass handed to me shouldn't have been a shock. Shaking myself, I turned off the car and got out. Well, it wasn't like I could humiliate myself in front of him any more than I already had. That was why I'd asked him in the first place. He already knew how bad I was. Maybe we could skip all that and jump straight to the part where he showed me how to be a less crappy fencer. Maybe then I could be good at something. I shoved that thought away. It wasn't that I wanted to be good at something. I had my strengths like everybody else. I wasn't stupid. I could paint. I could cook. I like to think I was competent when it came to academic shit. But I needed to be good at this. You're wasting your time, my mother had slurred after my first lesson. This is stupid. Fencing? My father had asked with a sneer. What in the world makes you think you could compete in fencing? Because fuck you both, that's why. Well, if I was going to take up a sport to spite my mother and outdo my father, it might as well be one that involved combat. Spite and stress relief, 2 birds, 1 foil, or something. I laughed at my own thought and shook my head. Between kicking myself over yesterday's match, getting worked up and nervous over today's session, and maybe just a little bit of fantasizing about my gruff new coach, I'd had next to no sleep last night. It wasn't even 9 yet, and the fatigue was already making my thoughts blurry and weird. Good thing I didn't have classes this morning. I pulled my duffel bag out of the trunk. As I put the strap over my shoulder, it rubbed against one of the bruises Mikhail had left yesterday. It smarted, and I gritted my teeth, wondering how many more of those colorful spots I'd have after today. Presumably, the lesson would be longer than the 5-minute bout, so he'd have plenty of opportunity to fuck me up. Great. A generic black sedan pulled in and parked a few spaces over. Just as I turned my head, Mikhail looked my way. a pair of dark sunglasses shielding his eyes. And I was awake now. My heart sped up. As he stepped out of the car, my mouth watered. Seeing him in weathered gray-white fencing gear had been one thing. A leather jacket and sunglasses? With his salt and pepper hair perfectly arranged instead of damp and slightly mussed? Holy shit. And he's like 50. Get a grip. Not that I was opposed to older guys, but I had a feeling he wasn't interested in anything beyond a fencing lesson or two. He probably wasn't even gay. All right, so I had no way of knowing if he was or wasn't, but statistically speaking, odds were he was straight. Mikhail slammed his trunk, hoisted his own bag onto his shoulder, and turned to me. He glanced at my car and paused, eyeing it. I tried not to fidget. His scrutiny unnerved me anyway. And now I had visions of him sneering that a college student who drove a BMW could afford some actual fencing lessons. Whatever he was planning to charge me, he probably just mentally tripled it. Fine. Name your price. But can we just go fence and not discuss? Without a word, Mikhail motioned for me to follow him toward the building. I did, feeling like an idiot for thinking he'd give two shits about what kind of car I drove, or that he gave two shits about anything except the fencing lesson he'd agreed to give me. Why should anything about me matter to him? The stairwell echoed with our footsteps, and I decided I was okay with that. There was no way he'd hear my thumping heart anyway, but I was kind of relieved that I couldn't hear it for a minute. At the top, Mikhail took out his keys, but when he tried the door, it was unlocked. Must be somebody here already. He pushed it open and gestured for me to go in ahead of him. This place was definitely nicer than the setup at the university. No surprise. I'd heard this club was well funded. Apparently, some local rich guys enjoyed fencing and made sure the group had a decent facility and the best equipment. It beat the hell out of the club I'd gone to back home, which had been little more than a drafty loft with second-hand equipment and an old storage room for changing clothes. That was even after I'd given them money to fix it up. Nothing had changed, so I doubted the funds had ever found their way past the treasurer, and the club wondered why I hadn't sent them more. This place, though? Hell, the electronic scoring equipment above the pistas looked like it was well maintained and might have actually worked. Apparently, they even had 2 locker rooms. I learned when Mikhail dismissed me to go change clothes. Meanwhile, he stopped to talk to the ponytailed woman who was already there. The woman smiled. Giving early lessons again, eh, Misha? I like it early. Mikhail actually smiled, like for real, as he hooked his sunglasses in his collar. It means there's no one else here. He chuckled. Well, aside from me? She laughed, and I wondered if his surprisingly charming smile screwed with her pulse too, or if she was used to it. I'll be out of your way in a few minutes. I was just doing some maintenance on the scoring equipment. She waved a hand toward the wires above our heads, which could be connected to weapons during a match to accurately keep score. Just don't use 5 or 6, okay? I need to order some parts. Noted. Mikhail looked at the equipment, then at me, and his eyebrows rose slightly like, why the fuck aren't you changing your clothes? I booked it into the locker room. As soon as I was alone, I released a long breath. I was here for a fencing lesson, and he was here to give me one. I didn't have to like him, he didn't have to like me. All I had to do was get my head together, focus on what I'd come here to learn, and maybe not concentrate quite so hard on him, or his smile, or how good he looked in that jacket and shades. I was ridiculous, I thought, as I dropped my bag on the bench in front of a row of lockers. He was good-looking, and I'd stopped getting laid recently, so, yeah, there were some hormones involved here. I couldn't imagine too many red-blooded gay men who wouldn't turn stupid after one look from Mikhail. Jackass or not, he could shut me up with his dick in my mouth any time. I shivered. Wouldn't that be hot? As I peeled off my shirt, the locker room door opened and closed. A second later, Mikhail walked through. I didn't look. Didn't actually see him, I just knew it was him. Okay, so maybe the squeak of his leather jacket gave him away, along with his sharp, fast gait, and aside from the woman he'd been talking to, I was pretty sure we were the only ones here. But the tingling along my spine said it was something else. Because I'm an idiot, a horny idiot who really needs to go out and get laid tonight, instead of jerking off to my goddamn fencing coach again. I shivered as I pulled on a faded red t-shirt. Not 5 seconds after I'd come last night, I'd rolled my eyes at the absurdity of fantasizing about him in the first place. Admittedly, though, it had been a pretty intense orgasm, and it wasn't like he had to know. A belt buckle jingled in the next alcove of lockers, and my pulse surged. God. Okay, so maybe I would be thinking about him again tonight, and probably should have this morning so I didn't wind up with a badly timed hard-on. He had enough reasons to think I was an idiot when I fenced. I paused, trying to remember what I'd been doing. Right. Changing into a pair of track pants, jeans didn't allow quite enough comfortable range of motion, and though it was warm in the fencing club, I didn't dare wear shorts. Mikhail was probably a sadistic bastard like my last club's assistant coach, the one who'd make sure no one wore shorts to training more than once. I swore I could still feel that throbbing bruise on my kneecap even 3 years later. And I was absolutely wearing a cup because Mikhail struck me as a bit of a bastard, and my not quite as much of a bastard coach back in Baltimore had used a foil to perform cup checks. I wasn't about to be caught without one if Mikhail did the same thing. A locker door closed with a metallic bang, and a lock clicked. Then Mikhail walked back out. Crap. I needed to get my shit together. I quickly finished changing clothes. When I stepped out of the locker room, Mikhail and the woman were talking again. He'd stripped off the leather jacket but was still wearing jeans and sneakers. The snug gray t-shirt was... God. Wow. 40, 50, or however old he was? The guy was ripped and he knew how to show it off. Oblivious to me staring at Mikhail's tightly wrapped torso, the woman gathered her purse and keys. "See you later, Misha." She offered me a friendly smile. I returned it. She and Mikhail exchanged a few more words, then she was gone and it was just us. "We'll take the first piste," he said. I followed him to the first painted lane and set my gear down next to it. "So, why do people call you Misha? I thought your name was Mikhail." "It is, and they do." He eyed me coldly. "And you'll call me Mikhail." I gulped. "Right, Mikhail, it is." I set my gear down, but kept my mask in my hand. "So, should we—" "You won't be needing it." I looked down at the mask in my hand, then at him. "Why not?" His eyebrow flicked up. Okay, coach has spoken. What about my foil?" "No foil without a mask, ever." I knew that. I did. And now I felt dumb for asking. Cheeks burning, I set the mask down on my bag beside my foil and joined him on the empty pista. He stood beside it like a referee. I cleared my throat. "Okay, so..." "You show me first position." The fuck? I gritted my teeth. Maybe I wasn't as good as he was, but I was no fucking beginner. I already...
First position."
I exhaled and turned to him. With all due respect, I asked for a lesson, not a remedial course from the beginning. Mikhail's features hardened.
"Are you telling me how to give a lesson?"
"What? No, but I don't want to waste your time or mine by..."
"By arguing with me about how I teach my students?"
He inclined his head.
"First position, or this lesson is over."
I was half tempted to tell him where he could shove the lesson, but I was already here. And maybe after playing his game for a little while, I'd finally learn what I'd come here to learn. I wanted to fence, not dance. But I faced forward and assumed first position. Heels together with my right foot pointed forward and the left at a 90-degree angle. There, first position. Happy? I swallowed my frustration. He was the instructor. He knew what he was doing, and he knew how bad I was at fencing. The fact that I wanted to be expert level right this second didn't change that, but damn it, did we have to start out crawling? Fine. So I wasn't ready to dance, but I could at least walk for fuck's sake. You show me en garde. I assumed the en garde stance. Back foot in the same place as before, front foot farther forward. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Okay, it was baby steps, but we'd get there. And then I realized my hands were hanging stupidly at my sides. I cautiously turned to Mikhail. What do I do with my hands without a foil? His brow creased.
You have had a foil in your hand every time you've practiced?
I nodded. Mikhail clicked his tongue.
I can see where your technique is lacking then. Your coaches were idiots.
I blinked, not even sure how to take that bluntness. Okay, so what do I do? He held out his arm like he was holding an imaginary foil, though his empty hand was just palm up and open.
Same as normal, just without the weapon.
Oh. It was awkward, but the coach had spoken. And if the weapon arm was supposed to be in the same place as normal, then so was my other arm, so I curled it upward behind me. Like this?
Yes.
Beat.
Show me in advance.
I did. I was annoyed as fuck because he'd seen my damn footwork before, but I did. He shook his head.
You're leading with your forward foot. Push off with your rear.
Leading with the... Push off with the... Wait, what? Mikhail eyed me.
Well?
Shit. Right, I'm supposed to actually do this. I advanced, concentrating on doing it the way he'd described, which turned an otherwise effortless movement into a clumsy one. My face burned and my stomach dropped. God, I must have looked like an...
Again.
I did, and it was still clumsy as...
Again.
Fuck, let me get my feet under...
Again.
Okay, that one was better, and...
Retreat.
I almost advanced, but caught myself and retreated. And at least that was slightly more graceful than my advances had been. He had me retreat a few more times, then advance again. His face was impossible to read. Was I doing this right? Was I completely butchering the footwork? Shit, I knew this stuff. Why was I second-guessing my technique so badly right now? And even if it was perfect, it probably wouldn't be enough to please him anyway. Story of my goddamn life. So I didn't know why I let myself get so worked up over it. He said nothing. I waited. The better part of a minute passed, and I started to wonder if he was waiting for me to...
Advance.
I did, and it was still stupidly clumsy.
Push off with your rear foot, Ryan.
I know, damn it, but I didn't argue.
Advance.
This time I hesitated, giving myself a few seconds to arrange the steps in my brain. Push off with the rear foot, heel-toe with the forward one, before I obeyed. My legs and feet cooperated more than before. It still wasn't my most graceful advance, but my weight shifted the way it was supposed to, and my forward foot came down where I'd intended. I glanced at Mikhail, and he gave the slightest nod. An unspoken but unmistakable, much better. My muscles relaxed as if they were hardwired into whatever part of his brain kept or withheld approval.
Advance.
I hesitated again, pulled my shit together, and advanced.
Good. Again.
That momentary praise gave me a mental boost. This time I didn't hesitate to do as I was told, and my feet did what they were supposed to do. The flustered feeling receded a little more each time he told me to advance, a little more with every good or yes. They were few and far between, but I hung on every one of them. Mikhail had me go all the way to the far end of the piste, my toe right on the boundary line.
Retreat.
Same game, but backwards this time, and once again, all the way to the end. When my heel landed on that boundary line, he started advancing me again. I lost count of the number of times we went back and forth. Sometimes he'd mix it up,
tell me to advance when I'd retreated a third of the way back down the pista, or having me retreat a few steps when I expected an advance. But it was advances and retreats with occasional praise, and constant reminders whenever I did them wrong. When he finally told me I could drop the on-guard position, my legs were shaky, and I was starting to sweat.
"All right,"
he said finally.
"well done. Walk it off and get some water."
Thank you. Of course, now my legs were made of rubber, and walking was more challenging than it should have been. As I dug my water bottle out of my bag, I tried not to think about how I'd get down the stairs and back to my car when this was over. Walking to class this afternoon would... Yeah, I'd think about that later. After I'd had a drink, I returned to the pista, and Mikhail didn't hesitate to get back to business.
"En garde."
Oh my God, my legs are killing me.
"Show me a lunge."
Without a foil? He eyed me. Right. I cleared my throat.
"Lunge."
I was nervous as fuck now. It was like trying to tie my shoe while someone was scrutinizing every move I made. Simple movements were suddenly too complex. I couldn't remember the order.
"Lunge, Ryan."
I lunged. It was a weird motion without a foil in my hand. The whole idea was to lunge forward, stretching my rear leg all the way out and dropping my forward foot as far forward as I could reach while driving the foil at my opponent. Ideally, his chest or stomach, so I'd get a point. With an empty hand, there was nothing to attack with, and with no opponent, nothing to aim for. I stretched my arm out as if I still held the foil because I didn't know what the fuck else to do with it. Before I could pull back to on guard, he put a hand up.
"Don't move."
I froze, still in a lunge. He walked around me, rubbing his lower lip with his thumb and looking me over like he was inspecting a sculpture or a statue. My thighs were starting to burn from holding this position, but I didn't dare move. As he came around in front of me again, he gestured at my forward knee.
"Bring your knee back just a little, so it isn't quite so far over your foot."
I did, muscles screaming because they didn't want to move any more at all.
"Good. It isn't incorrect to extend your knee that far, but you'll save your ligaments and tendons some strain like this."
Oh, okay. Thanks. Good to know." He nodded.
"And otherwise, your form is excellent."
I exhaled. Something rippled through me, and I smiled for a split second before I realized I probably looked like an idiot. Even as I schooled my expression, though, my heart still raced and his comments still echoed in my ears. I swallowed. Thank you. His gaze met mine, and something I couldn't read appeared in his expression. His blue eyes weren't as steely as they'd been before, and his jaw wasn't quite as firmly set. Not like we'd necessarily broken the ice, but maybe some of the sharpest edges had melted off. He motioned for me to pull back my lunge, and I did, muscles grateful for the relief. Well, for a second.
"Another lunge."
God damn it. I did as I was told, wincing a little.
"Again."
Just like with the advances and retreats, he made me lunge. And lunge, and lunge, and lunge. By the time he let up, I was dripping with sweat, my legs were shaking, my ass muscles ached. Even my arms were tired, and all they'd done was hover uselessly while I lunged, advanced, retreated, lunged, retreated, whatevered my legs into the floor.
"We'll call it a day,"
he said finally.
"You've got good form, particularly when you lunge, but you lack control. Advancing and retreating should be as effortless as walking."
It was until you told me I was doing it wrong. Mutely, I nodded.
"So, you've got potential,"
he said curtly.
"You just need to master the fundamentals."
His eyes narrowed slightly.
"You like discipline."
I gritted my teeth. I wanted to argue that I knew the fundamentals already, but after this lesson I was questioning my ability to even walk in a straight line, let alone fence with any semblance of skill. Okay, so when do we do this again? He held my gaze, the faintest hint of surprise registering on his face. You do want another lesson, then? Yes. Duh, man. Just when? He studied me again, the same way he had when he'd been scrutinizing my lunge form while my thighs had screamed and burned. Finally, he gave a slight nod. Next Sunday, 9 o'clock. There is a class here next week, so we won't be alone. I'm assuming the distraction won't be a problem. No, it won't. Good. Be ready for more footwork. He gestured at my feet. I'd suggest practicing a bit between now and then. I struggled to keep my irritation below the surface, though he could probably see my jaw working. I hated instructors who made me feel like an idiot, but I couldn't say no. I actually wanted to come back, not just to train, but to train with him. I'd already decided to prove my father wrong and be a better fencer than he was. Now I also needed to prove to Mikhail that he'd misjudged me too. So I nodded. Sunday at 9. See you then.